At exactly 6:47 p.m. on a Saturday evening in late October, my sister took a pair of fabric shears and cut straight through a wedding dress I had spent 14 hours sewing by hand. She didn't hesitate, she didn't apologize, and she didn't even look at me while she did it. She just said one sentence: "If you want to ruin my future, I'll ruin yours first." If you've ever been betrayed by your own family, not by strangers, not by enemies, but by people who share your last name, you already know how quiet that moment feels. Not loud, not dramatic, just cold, like something breaking inside you without making a sound. If that kind of story resonates with you, consider subscribing, because what happened after that dress was cut apart wasn't just revenge. It was the slowest, most precise unraveling of a lie I had lived inside for 27 years. My name is Emily Harper Collins. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a professional seamstress. Not a fashion designer, not a boutique owner, just a tailor who works in a small shop in Asheville, North Carolina, altering wedding gowns, prom dresses, and sometimes repairing clothes that carry more memories than fabric. Sewing was never supposed to be my career. It was supposed to be my mother's. My mother, Margaret Elaine Collins, opened Harper Alterations in 1998. It was a narrow storefront wedged between a laundromat and a locksmith, with a faded blue awning and a single front window displaying mannequins dressed in gowns she had saved from her favorite clients. She believed clothing wasn't just material. She believed every stitch carried a story. After she died 8 years ago, that belief became my responsibility. And that's how the betrayal began. My younger sister, Jessica Marie Collins, is 27. She never learned to sew. She never wanted to. She studied hospitality, management, worked in event planning, and eventually became a wedding coordinator for a mid-sized venue just outside the city. To her, weddings were logistics, timelines, guest lists, budgets. To me, they were something else entirely. They were the most fragile moments people trusted me with. And that's why what she did that Saturday night mattered more than anyone else could understand. Because she didn't just cut fabric. She cut something that represented everything I had built after our mother died. The dress she destroyed wasn't just any order. It was my largest commission in 7 years. A custom-designed, hand-stitched lace wedding gown valued at $9,800, commissioned by a client named Rachel Patterson for her December ceremony. More importantly, it was supposed to be the dress that changed my business. Rachel's wedding was being featured in a regional bridal magazine. If everything went well, Harper Alterations would receive a full profile in their winter issue exposure that could double my client base overnight. Jessica knew all of that. She knew exactly what the dress meant, which is why she chose that one. The argument that led to it started earlier that evening, inside the shop's back room. She had arrived unannounced around 6:30, her expression already tense, her voice sharp before she even sat down. "You need to tell Rachel to cancel the magazine feature," she said. I stared at her confused. "What are you talking about?" "She's booking her wedding through my venue," Jessica replied, "and the magazine deal conflicts with our exclusivity contract." That was the first time I heard about any contract. "What contract?" I asked. She crossed her arms. "The venue requires clients to approve all media exposure through us. You can't take independent publicity without permission." The statement didn't sound right. "Rachel signed directly with me," I said. "My agreement is separate from your venue." Jessica shook her head impatiently. "It doesn't matter. The venue controls the wedding branding. If the magazine runs your story, they'll credit your shop, not our event planning services." And then she said the sentence that changed everything. "You're jeopardizing my promotion." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she was really saying. "This isn't about contracts," I said quietly. "It's about credit." Her eyes hardened. "Yes," she said, "and I'm not letting you take it." The room fell silent. Because for the first time, the real conflict surfaced. This wasn't about logistics. It was about recognition, about whose success mattered more, about something far older than this one wedding. "What do you want me to do?" I asked finally. She answered without hesitation. "Tell Rachel to move her dress contract under our venue branding. Your shop gets paid normally, but all publicity goes through us." In other words, she wanted me to surrender the opportunity that could transform my business so her employer could claim the exposure instead. I shook my head slowly. "I can't do that." Her voice dropped immediately. "You won't," she corrected. The distinction mattered because it revealed what she truly believed, that I owed her compliance. I met her gaze steadily. "No," I said, "I don't." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked past me into the fitting room, and before I could react, she picked up the fabric shears from the cutting table. I didn't fully understand what she intended until the first slice cut through the lace. The sound was soft, almost delicate, which somehow made it worse. Because destruction doesn't always sound violent. Sometimes it sounds like something ending quietly. She cut 3 long, irreversible lines down the front panel before I reached her. By then, it was too late. The structural integrity of the dress was gone. Months of work destroyed in less than 10 seconds. She dropped the shears on the table and looked at me for the first time. "If you won't protect my future," she said, "I won't protect yours." Then she left. No apology, no explanation, just certainty. I stood there for a long time afterward, staring at the ruined fabric. Not crying, not shouting, just understanding something I had never allowed myself to see clearly before. This wasn't the first time Jessica had treated my work as something expendable. It was just the first time she had done it so openly. And the question that mattered most wasn't why she did it. It was something else entirely. Why did she believe she had the right? I didn't call the police that night. Most people ask me that when they hear the story. "Why didn't you report her?" That was destruction of property. Because technically, it wasn't. And that detail, the one I didn't understand fully at the time, is what made everything that followed possible. I locked the shop at 8:12 p.m., 2 hours later than usual, after carefully lifting the ruined dress off the mannequin and laying it flat on the cutting table. The lace was split in 3 long, clean cuts from neckline to waist, like deliberate surgical incisions. Jessica hadn't slashed wildly. She had cut precisely. She knew exactly where to destroy it, so it couldn't be repaired. That told me something important. This wasn't a loss of control. It was calculated. I went home that night and didn't sleep, not because of the dress, but because of a sentence she said that kept repeating in my head. "You won't protect my future." Protect. The word implied something deeper than a sibling argument. It implied obligation, as if my role in her life wasn't equal, as if I existed to support her. And when I traced that feeling backward, I realized something uncomfortable. It had always been that way. Jessica was 5 years younger than me. When she was born, our mother was already struggling to keep the shop afloat. After our father left, he walked out when I was 9, taking nothing except his pickup truck and a duffel bag. No child support, no contact, no explanation beyond one sentence he told our mother in the kitchen that night. I didn't sign up to live in a tailor shop. From that moment on, our mother worked 14-hour days to keep Harper Alterations alive. And I became her second pair of hands. I learned to thread a needle at 10, learned to measure hems at 12, learned to operate an industrial sewing machine before I had my driver's license. Jessica didn't. Our mother never expected her to. "You've done enough," she used to tell me. "Let your sister have a normal childhood." So I did. I cooked dinners, helped with homework, covered shifts at the shop after school. And when our mother died from a stroke 8 years ago, at age 56, there was never any question who would take over. I inherited the business. Or at least, that's what I believed. The next morning, after the dress incident, I opened the shop at 9:00 a.m. sharp, just like every weekday for the past 8 years. Routine is powerful. It keeps you steady when everything else feels unstable. At 9:17, I called Rachel Patterson to explain what happened. Her reaction was not what I expected. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten legal action. She just asked one question. Was it intentional? I hesitated. Yes, I said finally. There was a long pause. Then she said quietly, then this isn't about a dress. No, it wasn't. Rachel was kinder than she needed to be. She agreed to delay the wedding order while I attempted to recreate the gown from scratch. The timeline would be brutal, less than 6 weeks instead of 4 months. But she trusted me. That trust mattered more than the money, because losing that client wouldn't just hurt financially. It would damage my reputation. In a small town like Asheville, reputation spreads faster than advertising. At 10:42 a.m., Jessica texted me. One message. You should think carefully before making this public. Not an apology, a warning. I stared at the screen for a long time, because that message revealed something new. She wasn't worried about what she had done. She was worried about exposure. That's when I started to suspect there was more happening behind the scenes than I understood. And that suspicion led me to the one place I hadn't visited in years, the office safe. Our mother kept all business documents locked in a small steel safe inside the backroom closet. After her death, I inherited the key, along with everything else. Or so I thought. At 11:05 a.m., I unlocked it for the first time in over 2 years. Inside were the usual records, tax returns, lease agreements, supplier contracts, and the original business registration paperwork from 1998. I pulled out the registration certificate, owner Margaret Elaine Collins. That part was expected. Below that was the section labeled Transfer of Ownership. The date listed was 8 years ago, 2 weeks before our mother died. My name appeared there, Emily Harper Collins, but something else appeared beneath it. A notation I had never noticed before. Co-trustee authorization pending. I frowned. Co-trustee. I had never heard that term associated with the shop. There was no second signature listed, just a line that read, Final trustee designation to be confirmed upon execution of estate directive. Estate directive. That sounded like legal language tied to a will or trust document. But I had never seen any trust. Our mother's will had been straightforward. At least, that's what I believed. The shop goes to Emily. Savings divided equally between daughters. Simple, clear, final, or so I thought. I searched the safe again. No trust paperwork. No directive. Nothing explaining what co-trustee authorization meant. And that's when a memory surfaced unexpectedly. The day after our mother's funeral, Jessica had insisted on handling the estate paperwork. You've been running the shop, she told me at the time. Let me deal with the legal stuff. I had agreed because I trusted her, because I was exhausted, because grief makes you surrender control without realizing it. Standing in that back room 8 years later, holding the registration certificate in my hands, one question formed in my mind for the first time. What exactly had Jessica handled back then? At 12:14 p.m., I called the attorney who processed our mother's estate. His name was Daniel Whitaker. He answered on the third ring. Mr. Whitaker, I said, this is Emily Collins, Margaret Collins's daughter. There was a pause. Then his voice changed. Not surprised. Careful. I wondered when you might call, he said. That sentence made my stomach drop. Why would you expect that, I asked. Another pause. Then he said something that shifted the entire foundation of my life. Because he replied slowly. There was one document your mother asked me to release only when both daughters were ready to understand it. Both daughters, not just me. And he added quietly, I don't think either of you ever received it. The room felt suddenly smaller. What document? I whispered. His answer came in a tone that sounded almost apologetic. The final estate directive establishing operational control of Harper Alterations. Control, not ownership. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. Whatever that directive said, Jessica might have known about it all along, and I might have been running a business for 8 years under an assumption that was never fully true. At 2:03 p.m. that afternoon, I sat across from Daniel Whitaker in his office on College Street, staring at a sealed manila envelope with my mother's handwriting across the front. Release only when both daughters request together. The words felt heavier than the paper itself. For 8 years, that envelope had existed. For 8 years, neither Jessica nor I had opened it. And suddenly, that fact mattered more than anything else. "Why didn't you contact me?" I asked. Whitaker folded his hands on the desk. He was in his late 60s, the kind of attorney who spoke slowly and precisely, like every word had legal weight. "Because your mother was very clear," he said. "She did not want that directive released until both of you were present and requested it jointly." "Why?" I asked. He held my gaze. "Because she believed it would change your relationship." The sentence landed quietly, but it echoed loudly inside my chest. I swallowed. "Change it how?" Whitaker hesitated. Then he said something that sent a cold line down my spine. "She believed one of you might feel betrayed." The room fell silent, and in that silence, I understood something that had never occurred to me before. My mother had anticipated conflict between us. Not minor disagreements, not sibling rivalry, something deeper, something structural. "What does the directive say?" I asked. Whitaker tapped the envelope gently. "I can't open it without both signatures present." "Both!" The word sounded louder than it should have, because it meant one unavoidable reality. To learn the truth, I would have to involve Jessica, the same sister who had destroyed my work less than 24 hours earlier, the same sister who had just threatened me not to make the incident public. I leaned back in my chair. "So for 8 years, I said slowly, there's been a legal document defining control of the business, and neither of us knows what it says." Whitaker nodded. "That's correct." I stared at the envelope. It felt like looking at a locked door that had always been inside my house without me realizing it. "What happens?" I asked quietly, "if one of us refuses to open it?" Whitaker didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that changed the stakes completely. "Then the default clause remains in effect." I frowned. "What default clause?" He reached into a file drawer and pulled out a copy of the estate summary, a document I had never seen before. He slid it across the desk. At the bottom of the page, in small legal text, was a sentence that made my pulse spike. "In the absence of directive, execution, operational authority remains assigned to the designated interim trustee until joint confirmation is completed." I read the line twice, then a third time. "Who," I asked slowly, "is the interim trustee?" Whitaker met my eyes. "Your sister." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard. "That's not possible," I said. "She never worked in the shop." He shook his head. "Interim trusteeship doesn't require operational involvement. It only requires legal designation." My mind raced backward 8 years. The week after our mother died, Jessica insisting she would handle the estate paperwork. Me signing documents I barely read because I trusted her, because I was grieving, because I thought we were working together. And suddenly, something that had never made sense before snapped into place. Jessica's behavior over the years, her subtle authority over financial decisions, her insistence on reviewing contracts, her casual comments about protecting the business. All of it had never been about opinion. It had been about legal standing. She had held interim control for 8 years. Without telling me, a slow, heavy realization settled in my chest. She hadn't just destroyed a dress. She had been operating from a position of power I never knew existed. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked Whitaker. His expression was calm but firm. "Because your mother's directive required joint disclosure. Until both daughters requested it together, I was legally bound to remain silent." Legally bound. The phrase carried weight, which meant Jessica likely knew that too. which meant she had known something else, that as long as the directive stayed sealed, her interim authority would never be challenged. I felt a tightness in my throat. So she had no reason to open it, I whispered. Whitaker didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because the answer was obvious. If the directive threatened her control, keeping it sealed protected her position. And suddenly, the destruction of the wedding dress took on a new meaning. It wasn't just retaliation. It was intimidation, a reminder of power. Emily Whitaker said gently, "Your mother structured this arrangement for a reason." I looked at him. What reason? He leaned forward slightly. She believed you and your sister saw the business very differently. She hoped forcing you to open the directive together would require cooperation. Cooperation? The word sounded almost ironic now, because cooperation requires trust. And trust was the one thing that had just been shattered. I stood up slowly. So if I want to know what that directive says, I said, I have to bring Jessica here. Yes, he replied. I nodded once, because the reality had become clear. There was no way around her. If I wanted the truth, I would have to confront her. Not emotionally, legally. And for the first time since she cut that dress, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not grief, something colder. Clarity. Because now, I understood something that changed everything. Jessica hadn't just acted like she had authority. She had believed she did. And the question that mattered most wasn't whether she had used that power unfairly. It was something else. What exactly did my mother think needed protection so badly that she split control between us in the first place? I didn't call Jessica that afternoon. I didn't text her either. Instead, I went back to the shop, locked the front door, turned off the open sign, and sat alone in the fitting room with the ruined wedding dress draped across my lap. The lace felt lighter than it should have, like something hollow. I ran my fingers along the clean cuts she'd made. They were precise, deliberate placed exactly where the structural seams held the bodice together. She hadn't guessed. She knew where to cut, which meant she understood something she had always claimed she didn't. The business, the construction, the power behind it. And now I understood why. For 8 years, she had been the interim trustee, legally authorized to oversee the shop. While I had done the work, the realization wasn't explosive. It was quiet, like discovering a foundation crack that had existed under your house for years without you noticing. At 4:26 p.m., she called me, not to apologize, not to explain. Her voice was calm, controlled, almost businesslike. I assume you figured it out, she said. No greeting, no hesitation, just confirmation. So she knew I had gone to Whitaker, which meant she had expected it. Yes, I replied. I know about the interim trusteeship. There was a brief pause. Not surprise, recognition. Then you also know, she said, that I didn't do anything illegal. The words landed exactly the way she intended. Not defensive, not guilty, just factual. And that's when I realized something that made my chest tighten. She wasn't afraid of consequences, because from her perspective, she had followed the rules. You never told me, I said quietly. She exhaled the sound, controlled, because it didn't matter. It didn't matter. The sentence was simple, but it revealed everything. To her, the legal structure of our mother's estate wasn't something I deserved to understand. It was something she managed, like an executive handling a subordinate. I was the one running the shop, I said. Every day, every order, every client. And I was the one protecting it, she replied. The word again, protecting, as if I were a liability. As trustee, she continued, my responsibility was to ensure long-term stability, not emotional decisions. I closed my eyes for a moment, because suddenly, the entire dynamic of our relationship snapped into focus. She had never seen me as an equal partner. She had seen me as an operator, a skilled worker, not an owner. Is that why you wanted me to give up the magazine feature? I asked. Yes, she said immediately. Public exposure without centralized control creates risk. Risk, another business word. Detached, clinical, dehumanized. And destroying the dress, I asked. Her voice didn't change. That was necessary leverage. The phrase made something inside me go very still. Leverage. She had just described months of my work and a client's trust as a negotiation tactic. Do you hear yourself? I asked quietly. She didn't respond emotionally, because emotion wasn't the language she was speaking. Emily, she said, you need to stop thinking like a craftsperson and start thinking like an asset manager. An asset, not a sister, not a partner, an asset. And in that moment, I realized something that cut deeper than anything she had done. She didn't think she had betrayed me. She believed she was managing me, like part of the business infrastructure. I leaned against the cutting table, my hands steady. There's one problem with that, I said. Her voice cooled slightly. What problem? The directive, I replied. Silence. For the first time in the conversation, she didn't answer immediately, because that word changed the power balance. Yes, she said slowly. The directive. Why didn't you ever open it? I asked. Her tone hardened. Because it wasn't necessary. Not necessary. The words confirmed everything Whitaker had implied. As long as the directive remained sealed, her interim control remained unchallenged. You were afraid of what it might say, I said. That was when her voice sharpened for the first time. No, she replied quickly. But the speed of the response told me something else. She wasn't afraid. She was uncertain, and uncertainty threatened her authority. It doesn't matter what it says, she continued, because I've been the one ensuring the business survives. I took a slow breath. You mean controlling it? Another pause, and then she said something that finally exposed the core of everything. Someone had to, she said quietly, because you were never strong enough to do it. The words didn't hurt the way they once would have. They didn't sting. They clarified, because now I understood the narrative she had built in her mind. I wasn't an equal. I wasn't a partner. I was a risk, someone who needed oversight, someone who couldn't be trusted with full control. And for 8 years, she had believed she was protecting the business from me. You've been wrong about one thing, I said calmly. What she asked. You never protected the business, I replied. I paused, because the next sentence mattered. You protected your power. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to hear her breathing change. Not anger, not denial, recognition, because deep down, she knew it was true. I'm requesting the directive be opened, I said. Her voice tightened. That requires both of us. Yes, I replied. Another pause, longer this time, because she understood what that meant. If the directive confirmed her authority, she would win. If it didn't, everything she believed about her role could collapse. When she asked finally, tomorrow, I said, at Whitaker's office, 10 a.m. She didn't agree immediately, because this wasn't just a legal meeting. It was a confrontation with something she had avoided for 8 years. And in that silence, I realized something else. She wasn't worried about me anymore. She was worried about the truth. Fine, she said at last. Then she hung up. I stood alone in the quiet shop after the call ended, staring at the damaged dress still lying across the table. For the first time since she cut it, I understood what that act really represented. It wasn't rage, it was fear, because if the directive changed the balance of control, the power she had held for 8 years could disappear overnight. And tomorrow, for the first time since our mother died, we were both about to find out whether she had ever truly owned it at all. The next morning, I arrived at Daniel Whitaker's office at 9:52 a.m., 8 minutes early. Jessica was already there. That alone told me how much this meeting mattered to her. She sat in the waiting area with perfect posture, one ankle crossed over the other, her hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was attending a business conference, instead of opening a legal directive that could change both our lives. She didn't look at me when I walked in. Not immediately, but I could see tension in the way her fingers pressed together too tightly. For someone who claimed certainty, she was nervous. And that mattered, because nervousness only appears when control is no longer guaranteed. Whitaker greeted us with a calm nod and led us into his conference room. The sealed manila envelope lay at the center of the table, exactly where I had seen it the day before, unchanged, waiting. For a moment, none of us sat down. Jessica spoke first. Before we open it, she said, her tone controlled, "I want something clarified." Whitaker gestured for her to continue. "The directive," she said, "does not override the interim trusteeship unless explicitly stated." She wasn't asking. She was asserting, trying to establish legal ground before the truth surfaced. Whitaker met her gaze evenly. "That depends entirely on the language inside the document," he replied. A small muscle moved along Jessica's jaw, because that wasn't the reassurance she wanted. We sat down. Whitaker placed 2 signature forms in front of us. "Both of you must sign consent for release," he said. I picked up the pen without hesitation. Jessica didn't. She stared at the envelope for a long moment before signing. That hesitation lasted only 5 seconds, but it revealed something she would never admit. She wasn't confident. She was uncertain. Once both signatures were complete, Whitaker broke the seal carefully and removed a thick stack of documents. The first page bore my mother's signature, Margaret Elaine Collins, dated 2 weeks before her death. The sight of her handwriting hit me harder than I expected, because it made her feel suddenly present in the room, as if she had anticipated this exact moment. Whitaker began reading aloud. "This directive establishes the final operational authority structure of Harper Alterations following the passing of the owner." His voice remained steady, professional, but each word felt heavier than the last. "Due to differing strengths between my daughters, I assigned distinct roles to ensure long-term stability." I felt Jessica shift beside me, because that sentence alone suggested something she hadn't expected. Whitaker continued, "Emily Harper Collins shall hold sole, creative, and client authority. All operational decisions related to production, design, customer relations, and business direction are under her exclusive control." I blinked. Sole authority. Exclusive control. The words didn't register immediately, because they contradicted everything Jessica had believed. Whitaker turned the page. "Jessica Marie Collins shall hold financial oversight authority only. Her interim trusteeship exists to provide structural accountability, not operational control." Jessica's hand tightened on the edge of the table, because in one sentence, 8 years of her assumptions shifted. Financial oversight, not leadership, not ownership, not decision-making power over the business itself. Oversight. Whitaker continued reading. "The directive further states that any use of trusteeship authority to override operational control constitutes a violation of estate intent." The room fell completely silent, because that sentence carried enormous weight. It meant something very clear. Jessica had not been authorized to control business decisions. She had only been authorized to monitor financial stability. Nothing more, nothing less. Whitaker finished reading the final paragraph. "This structure reflects my belief that Emily understands the heart of the business, while Jessica understands the structure that protects it. Only together can the shop survive. But leadership belongs to Emily. Leadership, not shared, not equal, assigned." And for the first time in 8 years, the legal truth of our mother's intentions was unmistakable. Jessica spoke after a long silence. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but strained. "This directive was never implemented," she said. Whitaker shook his head gently. "That is incorrect. It became legally active the moment it was signed." Jessica's eyes hardened, but it was never disclosed. Because Whitaker replied, "Neither of you requested it together." The distinction mattered, because it meant something devastatingly simple. For 8 years, the directive had been valid, and she had chosen not to open it. She leaned back in her chair, slowly absorbing the reality. "You're saying," she said carefully, "that operational authority was never mine?" Whitaker nodded once. "That is correct." The room felt very still, Jessica didn't argue. She didn't shout. She didn't deny. She simply stared at the document like it was something foreign, because the foundation of her identity had just shifted. For 8 years, she believed she had been protecting the business from my emotional decisions. Now she was discovering something she had never considered. She had never actually had the right to override me. Not once, not legally, not structurally. And suddenly, the destruction of the wedding dress took on an entirely different meaning. It wasn't just leverage. It was a violation of authority she never possessed. Whitaker closed the folder gently. From this moment forward, he said, the directive is fully disclosed and legally binding. Jessica didn't respond. She remained very still, because she understood something now that she had never allowed herself to face before. She hadn't been protecting the business. She had been controlling something that was never hers to control. And in that moment, for the first time since our mother died, the balance of power shifted completely. Jessica didn't speak for almost a full minute after Whitaker finished explaining the directive. She just sat there staring at the document, her expression frozen in a way I had never seen before. Not angry, not defensive, just suspended. Because this wasn't a disagreement she could argue her way out of. It was a structural correction. For 8 years, she had built her identity around being the one in control, the one making decisions, the one protecting the business from what she saw as emotional risk. Now she was facing a reality she had never prepared for. She had never been the one in charge. Not legally, not by our mother's design, not in the way she believed. Finally, she exhaled slowly and looked up at Whitaker. So what happens now? She asked. The question wasn't confrontational. It was practical. And that told me something important. She was already shifting into survival mode. Whitaker answered calmly. Now the directive becomes fully active, he said. Emily holds exclusive operational authority. You retain financial oversight responsibilities. Both roles continue. Jessica nodded slowly. Her voice remained steady. In the past 8 years, Whitaker didn't hesitate. The directive has always been legally valid, he said. However, because it remained undisclosed, enforcement was not triggered. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean in practical terms? It means, Whitaker replied, that prior decisions made under the interim trusteeship are not automatically invalid, but actions taken outside your authorized scope may be subject to review. Review. The word hung in the air like a warning. Because review meant accountability, Jessica turned toward me for the first time since the reading. Her expression wasn't angry. It was calculating. How far do you intend to take this? She asked. I understood the real question beneath the words. Was I going to pursue consequences for what she had done? Or was I going to accept the new balance and move forward quietly? I didn't answer immediately, because the answer mattered. Not just for her, for me, for the business, for everything that came next. Whitaker, I said. Instead, what happens when someone violates the directive? He looked at me carefully. If a trustee knowingly exceeds their authorized scope, he said it can constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. Jessica's posture stiffened slightly. What kind of breach? She asked. Whitaker's tone remained calm. Potentially civil liability. In severe cases, removal of trusteeship. Removal. The word landed with quiet force. Because losing trusteeship would mean losing the last form of authority she still held. And destruction of business property, I asked quietly. Whitaker didn't look surprised. He answered like he had expected the question. That could qualify as operational interference, he said, particularly if it caused measurable financial harm. Jessica spoke quickly, then her voice sharper than before. That wasn't a financial decision. That was a personal conflict. Whitaker met her gaze evenly. Intent doesn't change impact, he said. The room fell silent again. Because that sentence clarified everything. It didn't matter whether she believed she was protecting the business. It mattered what she actually did. And what she had done caused measurable damage. Nearly $10,000 in lost work. a threatened client relationship, reputational risk. All of it tied directly to her actions. Jessica turned back to me, so she said slowly, "This is where you decide whether you want revenge or stability." The word revenge hung between us, but it didn't fit the way she thought it did. Because what I felt wasn't revenge. It was clarity. "I don't want revenge," I said calmly. She watched me carefully. "What do you want?" I answered without hesitation. "I want boundaries." The sentence changed something in the room. Because boundaries don't punish. They define limits. They establish where control ends and where responsibility begins. Whitaker nodded slightly. "That is precisely what this directive was designed to create," he said. Jessica looked back at the document on the table. For the first time since it was opened, her expression softened slightly. Not with regret, but with something closer to recognition. "She never trusted either of us completely," she said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "She trusted both of us differently." Jessica exhaled slowly. Because that distinction mattered. Our mother hadn't divided us out of fear. She had divided authority out of balance. She had known our strengths, and she had known our weaknesses. Whitaker closed the folder and slid it toward me. "You both have decisions to make," he said. "But legally, the structure is now clear." We stood. The meeting was over. But the consequences were only beginning. Jessica stopped at the doorway before leaving. She didn't turn toward me immediately. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than I expected. "You're going to review everything she said." It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. "Yes," I replied. She nodded once. Not defensive, not hostile, just accepting. "Then you'll find more than you think she said." The sentence made my stomach tighten, because it implied something I hadn't considered yet. The dress wasn't the only damage, and the trusteeship wasn't the only place where authority had been stretched beyond its limits. She opened the door and left. I remained standing in Whitaker's office, holding the directive in my hands. For 8 years, I believed I had inherited the business completely. Now, I understood something far more complicated. I had inherited leadership, but leadership comes with something else. Responsibility for everything that happened under your watch, even the parts you never saw. And as I walked back to the shop that afternoon, one question stayed in my mind. If Jessica had exceeded her authority once, how many other decisions had she made that I never knew about? Jessica didn't contact me for 9 days after the directive was opened. Not a call, not a text, not even a message about the shop's financial reports, which she normally sent every Monday morning without fail. At first, I expected anger, then defensiveness, eventually some kind of confrontation. Instead, there was nothing, and that silence unsettled me more than any argument could have. Because people who rely on control rarely surrender it quietly. They withdraw, they observe, they wait, and waiting often means they're planning something. The shop itself, however, remained steady. Routine once again became my anchor. I reopened Rachel Patterson's dress order the very next morning after the meeting with Whitaker. The ruined lace couldn't be repaired, but the base fabric underneath was still usable, which meant something important. Jessica had cut to destroy visibility, not structure. She had wanted the damage to look final, but technically it wasn't. And that realization gave me an unexpected sense of clarity, because her actions had always been designed to intimidate, not to completely destroy. That distinction mattered, because intimidation only works when the target believes they have no options. At 11:13 a.m. on the 10th day, Jessica finally appeared at the shop. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She just walked in through the front door while I was fitting a bridesmaid dress on a client. I saw her reflection in the mirror before I heard her voice. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. Not cold, not sharp, just controlled. I finished the fitting before acknowledging her. That wasn't intentional. It was simply how the shop worked. Clients came first, always. When the customer left, I locked the door and turned the sign to closed. Jessica was standing near the cutting table, her eyes fixed on the shelves of thread spools lining the wall. "I reviewed the financial records," she said. That sentence immediately tightened something in my chest, because of what she had told me in Whitaker's office. "You'll find more than you think." "What did you find?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a manila folder from her bag and placed it on the table between us. Inside were copies of bank statements, vendor invoices, and internal transfer logs. She pointed to a series of entries highlighted in yellow. "These transactions," she said, "go back 5 years." I leaned closer. They weren't large amounts. $2,000 here, $3,000 there. Occasional withdrawals, marked as vendor settlement adjustments. "What are they?" I asked. Jessica hesitated. Then she said something that changed the shape of everything. "Unauthorized loans." My breath caught. "Loans to who?" Her eyes met mine directly. "To the business." The words took a moment to process. "What do you mean?" I asked. She tapped the documents. "For years, the shop has been operating at a loss during slow seasons," she said. "Mom knew that. That's why she structured the Directive with financial oversight." I stared at the numbers. They showed a pattern. Every winter, when wedding orders dropped and revenue dipped, small deposits appeared from an external account. Not vendor refunds, not insurance payouts, personal transfers. "From Jessica." "You've been funding the shop," I said quietly. She nodded once. For 5 years, the realization hit me slowly, because it contradicted everything I believed about her motivations. "You never told me," I said. Her voice was steady. "Because I wasn't supposed to." I frowned. "Why not?" She leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. "Because if you knew the business was struggling, you would have made emotional decisions." There it was again, the same belief she had always carried, that my leadership required containment. But this time, something was different. There was no accusation in her tone, only fact. "And the Directive?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "I knew it might limit my authority," she said. "But I also knew something else." "What?" She met my gaze without hesitation. "That if I opened it, you would see the financial vulnerabilities." The words landed heavily, because they revealed something unexpected. She hadn't kept the Directive sealed only to protect her power. She had also kept it sealed to protect me. Or at least, that's how she justified it. "You thought I couldn't handle it," I said quietly. She didn't deny it. "No," she replied. "I thought you would sacrifice stability for growth." Her honesty wasn't comforting, but it was clarifying, because for the first time, I saw the full picture of her mindset. She wasn't acting out of jealousy. She wasn't acting out of cruelty. She was acting out of fear. Fear that the business couldn't survive without strict control, and fear that I would take risks she believed were dangerous. I closed the folder slowly. "Why show me this now?" I asked. Her answer came immediately. "Because the Directive is active," she said. "And that means you deserve the full truth." Deserve. The word sounded different coming from her now. Less like a concession, more like acceptance. The shop fell quiet around us. Outside, a delivery truck passed its engine noise, fading into the distance. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "You're going to find out the biggest problem soon," she said. My chest tightened again. "What problem?" She hesitated. And for the first time since she walked in, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. "Not financial," she said. "Legal." The word hung in the air like a shadow. Because legal problems don't just threaten money. They threaten existence. "What legal problem?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she picked up one document from the folder and slid it toward me. At the top was a name I recognized immediately. Harper Alterations, LLC lease agreement renewal notice. Dated 3 months ago. Signed by our landlord. And below that, in bold red text, was a single sentence that made my pulse spike. "Final property sale, pending tenant occupancy, subject to termination clause." I looked up at her slowly. "They're selling the building," I whispered. She nodded once. "And the new owner," she said quietly, "has no obligation to renew our lease." The room suddenly felt very small. Because the shop wasn't just a business. It was the only physical piece of our mother that remained. And now, for the first time, I understood something terrifying. All the conflicts between Jessica and me had been happening while the ground beneath us was already shifting. For several minutes after Jessica showed me the lease notice, neither of us spoke. I just stared at the document on the table, reading the same line over and over, as if the words might change if I looked long enough. Final property sale, pending tenant occupancy, subject to termination clause. Termination clause. Not negotiation, not renewal, termination. How long have you known? I asked quietly. Jessica didn't try to soften it. Since July, she said. My head snapped up. July, I repeated. That was 3 months ago. She nodded. The landlord notified all tenants privately before listing the building. He said he wanted to give long-term occupants time to prepare. Time to prepare. The phrase sounded almost cruel now, because preparation requires transparency. And she had never told me. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. She didn't flinch. Because there was nothing you could do yet, she replied. My voice sharpened. I could have planned, looked for another location, negotiated. You would have panicked, she interrupted calmly. That sentence stopped me. Not because it was true, but because it revealed something deeper. Even now, after everything, she still believed she knew what I could handle better than I did. You don't get to decide that anymore, I said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight, because this time, I wasn't asking for acknowledgement. I was establishing a boundary. Jessica held my gaze for a moment. Then slowly, she nodded. You're right, she said. It was the first time she had said those words without argument. But it didn't erase what came next. The buyer, she continued, isn't just any investor. My chest tightened again. Who is it? She hesitated. That hesitation alone told me something important. This wasn't just a business transaction. It was personal. It's Summit Development Group, she said finally. The name meant nothing to me, until she added one more detail. They specialize in converting historic retail spaces into boutique hotel properties. Hotel. The word hit like a physical weight, because Harper Alterations didn't just exist inside that building. It was part of the building's identity. The front display window, the fitting rooms, the long wooden cutting table my mother had installed herself. All of it was woven into the structure. They're not planning to keep any tenants, Jessica said quietly. They want the entire block cleared. Cleared, not relocated, not negotiated, erased. I felt something cold settle into my stomach. When does the sale finalize? I asked. Jessica flipped another page in the folder. 30 days, she said. 30 days. The number echoed loudly in my mind. 30 days to relocate a business built over 25 years. 30 days to find a new location, move equipment, inform clients, and preserve a reputation. It was almost impossible. Almost. I sank into the chair beside the cutting table, because suddenly, everything else felt smaller. The directive, the trusteeship, the betrayal, all of it paled in comparison to the possibility of losing the shop entirely. How much did you know? I asked quietly. Jessica didn't try to minimize it. I knew they were serious, she said, but I thought I could negotiate a long-term lease extension. My head lifted sharply. You tried? Yes. The word came without hesitation. I contacted them in August, she continued, presented financial stability reports, offered to increase rent, and I asked. Her expression hardened slightly. They weren't interested. Silence settled between us again, because the reality was clear. This wasn't about money. It was about redevelopment, which meant sentiment had no value. Why show me now? I asked. Her answer came slower this time. Because there's one more thing, she said. My chest tightened again. What? She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin stack of legal papers. At the top was a letter from Summit Development Group's legal department, dated last week. The subject line read, Preliminary Tenant Relocation Compensation Proposal. I frowned. They're offering to buy us out. Jessica nodded. They want us to vacate voluntarily within 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks. Not 30 days. 2. And the compensation I asked. Her eyes met mine. $85,000. The number sounded large at first, until I processed what it really meant. It wasn't compensation for the business. It was compensation for silence, for leaving without legal resistance, for surrendering quickly. That's barely enough to move equipment, I said. Jessica nodded. It's not meant to be fair, she said quietly. It's meant to be fast. I stared at the letter because something inside me had shifted. Not panic, not fear, something else. Clarity. Because now I understood something that changed the stakes completely. Jessica hadn't been fighting me for control of the business. She had been fighting to keep the business alive. While I had been focused on creative growth, she had been quietly trying to prevent its disappearance. The realization settled heavily between us. You should have told me, I said softly. Her voice came just as quietly. I was trying to fix it first. Fix it! The word held exhaustion. Because some problems can't be fixed by control alone. And this one had never been hers to solve by herself. For the first time since she cut that dress, I saw something in her expression I hadn't recognized before. Not arrogance, not superiority. Fear, real fear, because losing the shop meant losing the last piece of our mother that still existed in physical form. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back on the table. 2 weeks, I said. Jessica nodded. That's their deadline for voluntary exit. I looked around the shop, at the shelves of thread, at the measuring tape hanging from a hook near the mirror, at the cutting table, worn smooth by decades of work. And in that moment, one question rose above all the others. Not whether we could save the shop, but something far more complicated. If the building was sold, who would benefit most from making sure Harper Alterations disappeared quietly? I didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, because of calculation. For the first time since the building sale surfaced, I stopped thinking emotionally about what Harper Alterations meant. Instead, I started thinking the way Jessica had always thought, structurally, legally, strategically. Because if Summit Development Group wanted us gone quickly, it meant one thing. They were trying to avoid something, and companies only rush buyouts when delaying creates risk. At 7:12 a.m. the next morning, I was already at the shop, sitting at the back desk, with the relocation letter spread open in front of me. Jessica arrived at 7:34. She looked surprised to see me already working. You never come in this early, she said. I needed time to think, I replied. She didn't ask what I was thinking about, because she already knew. How much do we actually know about Summit Development? I asked. Jessica leaned against the desk. Enough to know they buy distressed properties, she said. They clear tenants fast and flip buildings within a year. Distressed properties? The phrase stuck with me. This building isn't distressed, I said. No, she replied quietly, but it has one liability. I looked up. Us, she nodded. Because long-term tenants complicate redevelopment timelines. Evictions create legal battles. Buyouts are faster, but something still didn't add up. If they wanted to avoid legal delays, I said slowly, why give us a compensation offer at all? Jessica frowned slightly. Because they need us to leave voluntarily, she said. Exactly, I replied. I slid the relocation letter toward her and pointed to the signature block at the bottom. She leaned closer. Then her expression changed instantly, because she saw it too. The name printed above the signature line wasn't a corporate executive. It wasn't a legal representative. It was a personal name. Daniel Whitaker. Jessica blinked. That's not possible, she whispered. My stomach dropped, because Daniel Whitaker wasn't just a random attorney. He was our family estate lawyer, the same man who had held our mother's directive for 8 years. And now his name appeared as legal counsel for the company trying to force us out. How is he involved with Summit Development? Jessica asked. I didn't answer immediately, because the answer, forming in my mind, felt too heavy to speak out loud. Maybe he's just their attorney, she said quickly, trying to rationalize it. But something about the situation felt wrong. Whitaker had always presented himself as neutral, professional, bound by legal ethics. Yet here he was, representing the buyer of the building housing our business, the same business connected to the estate he managed. That overlap wasn't just suspicious. It was a conflict. Did he ever mention this? I asked. Jessica shook her head slowly. No, neither had he mentioned it to me, which meant something very specific. He had chosen not to disclose it, and that realization shifted the entire situation. Because if Whitaker was involved in the property sale, he had known about the building transfer long before we did. He had known Harper Alterations was at risk, and he had said nothing. The silence felt suddenly heavier, not just because of the building, but because of the trust we had placed in him for years. Jessica sat down slowly. This doesn't make sense, she said. He's legally obligated to avoid conflicts of interest. Yes, I replied quietly, which means either he isn't acting in conflict, I paused, or we don't understand the full picture yet. Jessica stared at the letter again. If he represents Summit, she said slowly, then he has a legal duty to them. And that duty, I finished, could override any loyalty to us. The realization landed heavily between us, because it meant something far more dangerous than losing the building. It meant the one person we trusted to protect our mother's legal intentions might now be working against us. Jessica exhaled slowly. What do we do? She asked. For the first time since this began, her voice carried uncertainty, directed toward me. Not toward the situation, toward my leadership, because now the directive mattered in a way it never had before. I leaned back in my chair. We don't confront him yet, I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Why not? Because if we're right, I replied, he already knows we're vulnerable. She understood immediately, and confronting him would show our hand. Yes, silence filled the shop again, but this silence felt different, not tense, focused, because now we weren't reacting. We were preparing. Jessica spoke again after a moment. There's something else, she said quietly. My chest tightened. What? She reached into the folder and pulled out one more document. A property transfer timeline. The building sale agreement had been signed 6 months ago. 6 months, which meant Whitaker had known about it for half a year, long before he read the directive to us, long before we had any chance to prepare, long before the relocation offer. I felt a cold wave of realization settle in my chest, because suddenly everything aligned. The timing, the silence, the pressure to leave quickly. This wasn't just a redevelopment deal. It was strategic. And one question rose above all the others. If Whitaker had known about the building sale for 6 months, why had he waited until after the directive was opened to push relocation? At exactly 10:18 a.m. on Thursday morning, Jessica and I walked into Daniel Whitaker's office without an appointment. We didn't call ahead. We didn't warn him. Because this time, preparation wasn't about politeness. It was about timing. If he truly represented Summit Development Group, he already knew we were under pressure to accept the relocation buyout quickly, which meant any conversation we initiated on his terms would only reinforce his advantage. So we chose the only moment he wouldn't control. Surprise! His assistant looked startled when we entered the reception area together. Do you have an appointment? She asked carefully. No, I replied, but he'll want to see us. Something in my voice must have carried enough certainty, because she hesitated only briefly before knocking on his office door. A moment later, she gestured for us to enter. Whitaker stood behind his desk when we walked in. His expression didn't show shock. He was too disciplined for that. But I saw a flicker of something else. Recognition. As if he had expected this confrontation eventually. Emily. Jessica, he said calmly. What can I help you with? He knew. He had to. Because the moment he saw both of us arrive together, he would understand what it meant. We didn't sit down. I placed the relocation letter on his desk and turned it so the signature block faced him. He didn't look surprised. He just glanced down briefly, then back at me. Yes, he said quietly. I represent Summit Development. There it was. No denial, no attempt to conceal it, because legally he couldn't. What you didn't disclose, I said calmly, was that you represented both our mother's estate and the company purchasing our building. His gaze remained steady. That is not a legal conflict, he replied. My representation of the estate concluded when probate closed 8 years ago. The answer was technically correct, but technical correctness wasn't the whole truth. You still held the directive, Jessica said. Yes, he replied, which means you still had a fiduciary obligation related to the estate. Whitaker's expression didn't change, but his voice shifted slightly. My obligation was limited to document custody, he said, not business advisory. His words were precise, carefully constructed, because he was speaking like a lawyer, now, not a family advisor. And knowing the building was being sold, I said quietly, you didn't think that information was relevant to the directive you were holding. That was the first time his silence lasted longer than a few seconds. Because this question wasn't purely legal, it was ethical. Finally, he spoke. My role required neutrality, he said. Intervening in your business affairs would have violated that neutrality. Neutrality. The word sounded cold, detached, because neutrality isn't the same as fairness. It's simply non-interference. Jessica stepped forward slightly. You didn't just remain neutral, she said. You facilitated a deal that directly threatens the business our mother entrusted to us. Whitaker met her gaze evenly. I facilitated a property transaction, he replied. I did not create the conditions that led to it. That answer shifted the entire conversation because it suggested something we hadn't considered. What conditions? I asked quietly. He paused, long enough for the silence to feel intentional. Then he said something that changed everything. The landlord chose to sell because the building had become financially unstable. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? I asked. Whitaker opened a file drawer and removed a thin stack of documents. These are public records, he said. Property tax liens filed over the past 3 years. He slid them across the desk. I scanned the pages. Unpaid property taxes, mounting penalties, legal notices. The landlord had been in financial distress. The building wasn't sold because of redevelopment opportunity. It was sold because the owner couldn't afford to keep it. That's why Summit moved quickly, Whitaker said. They specialize in distressed acquisitions. Jessica's voice came quieter now. You knew this months ago? Yes, and you said nothing. His eyes held mine. Because it was not my place to intervene. The words landed heavily, because they revealed something painful. He hadn't betrayed us. He had simply chosen not to help us. And there is a difference between those two things. But the outcome feels very similar. I took a slow breath. There's one more question, I said. He nodded. The buyout offer, I continued. Why is it structured so aggressively? Whitaker's expression remained calm. Because Summit needs clear occupancy to secure financing, he said. That answer made sense, but it wasn't the full truth. I could feel it. Is there another reason? I asked. He hesitated, just briefly. But that hesitation confirmed what I already suspected. There is one complication, he said finally. My chest tightened. What complication? Whitaker folded his hands on the desk. The building contains a historical preservation designation. The words took a moment to process. Preservation, Jessica repeated. Yes, he said. Harper Alterations was listed as a culturally significant local business 5 years ago. I felt a sharp pulse of realization because that designation meant something specific. It meant the shop wasn't just a tenant. It was part of the building's historical identity, and removing it could trigger legal review. That's why they want us to leave voluntarily, I whispered. Whitaker nodded. If you refuse relocation, he said the redevelopment timeline could be delayed by years. The room went completely silent because suddenly the balance of power shifted. Not to us fully, but enough. Summit didn't just want us gone. They needed us to leave quietly. And for the first time since this began, I saw something in Whitaker's expression that hadn't been there before. Not neutrality, respect, because now he understood something he hadn't expected. We were no longer vulnerable. We were negotiating. The moment Whitaker confirmed the historical preservation designation, everything changed. Not dramatically, not emotionally, structurally. Because until that moment, Jessica and I had been operating under one assumption, that we were the ones under pressure. Now, we understood something different. Summit Development needed us more than we needed them. And that shifted the balance completely. We didn't say anything right away. Silence can be a powerful negotiating tool, especially when the other side expects you to react emotionally. Whitaker watched us carefully, his expression calm but attentive. He knew we were recalculating. Jessica spoke first. "What exactly does the preservation designation protect?" she asked. Whitaker answered without hesitation. "It protects the continuity of culturally recognized businesses within the property," he said. "If a listed business is displaced involuntarily, redevelopment can be legally challenged." Jessica nodded slowly. "And that challenge could delay construction." "Indefinitely," Whitaker replied. The word hung in the air. Indefinitely. That wasn't a small inconvenience for a development company. It was a financial nightmare. Delays meant lost investors, lost financing, lost timelines. Suddenly, the $85,000 buyout offer looked very different. It wasn't compensation. It was a bargain. They were trying to secure our cooperation cheaply before we understood our leverage. I leaned forward slightly. "What would happen," I asked, "if we refused to leave?" Whitaker met my gaze evenly. "Summit would likely attempt formal eviction through the termination clause," he said. But he added carefully, "You could file a preservation challenge, which would freeze redevelopment until a review board ruled." "And how long would that take?" I asked. He paused. 18 months to 3 years, he said. Jessica exhaled slowly, because that timeline changed everything. 3 years of delay on a multi-million-dollar project would cost Summit far more than relocating one small tailoring shop. Which means, I said quietly, they're negotiating from a position of urgency. Whitaker nodded. Yes, he didn't resist the statement, because it was true. Jessica turned toward me then, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not defensiveness, not superiority, trust. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The question mattered, because 8 years ago, she would have decided alone. Now she was asking. That shift was the real impact of the directive. I took a slow breath before answering. "I don't want revenge," I said. Jessica's shoulders relaxed slightly. "But I do want stability," I continued. "And fairness," she nodded. Because those goals aligned with everything she had always tried to protect, even if her methods had been flawed. Whitaker watched us quietly. "You have strong negotiating leverage," he said, "but you must decide what outcome you want." Outcome. Not victory, not punishment. Outcome. The distinction mattered, because revenge focuses on what the other side loses. Justice focuses on what you secure. I thought about the shop, the cutting table, the worn wooden floors, the clients who trusted me with their most important moments. And I realized something clearly. I didn't need the building itself. I needed the business to survive. "We negotiate relocation," I said finally. Jessica nodded immediately. Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "And your terms," I answered calmly. "Full relocation funding. A new commercial space secured at Summit's expense. Compensation for lost revenue during transition." Jessica added quietly, "And preservation recognition transferred to the new location." Whitaker nodded once. "All reasonable," he said. "Given your leverage, they would likely agree." He paused before adding something else. "There is one more factor you should consider." I looked at him. "What factor?" His voice softened slightly. "Summit's lead investor is local," he said, "and highly concerned with public image." Public image. The phrase clarified something important. This wasn't just about legal leverage. It was about reputation. And in a town like Asheville, reputation matters deeply. Which means Jessica said slowly, "They want this resolved quietly." "Yes," Whitaker replied. The room fell silent again, but this silence felt different from any we had experienced before. It wasn't tense. It wasn't uncertain. It was steady. Because for the first time since the building sale surfaced, we weren't reacting. We were choosing. Whitaker closed his file folder. "If you wish," he said, "I can arrange a negotiation meeting with Summit's representatives." I met Jessica's gaze. She nodded once. "Yes," I said. As we stood to leave, Whitaker spoke again. "Emily," I turned back. "I know you may feel I failed you by remaining neutral," he said. I considered his words carefully before responding. "You didn't fail us," I said quietly. "You simply didn't protect us." The distinction mattered, because protection was never his role. It was ours. He nodded slowly, because he understood that now. Jessica and I left his office together, walking out into the bright afternoon sunlight. For a few steps, neither of us spoke. Then she said something softly. "You handled that better than I ever could have." I glanced at her. "That's because you always handled the parts." "I couldn't," I replied. The words weren't an apology. They weren't forgiveness. They were acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is the first step towards something stronger than either of those. As we walked back toward the shop, one realization settled quietly between us. The conflict between us had never been about power. It had been about fear. Fear of losing the business. Fear of losing our mother's legacy. Fear of losing each other. And now, for the first time since all of this began, that fear no longer controlled the outcome. The negotiation meeting took place 2 weeks later at exactly 2:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. Not in a courtroom, not in a corporate office, but in the same building that housed Harper Alterations. Because Summit Development had agreed to meet on site, that decision alone told us something important. They wanted to resolve this quietly, and they wanted to do it fast. Jessica and I sat side by side at the long cutting table, the one our mother had installed 25 years earlier. Across from us sat 2 representatives from Summit. Their lead negotiator, a woman named Caroline Brooks, introduced herself calmly, professionally. No hostility, no arrogance, because she already knew something we understood too. This wasn't a battle, it was a negotiation. Whitaker sat at the end of the table as a legal counsel, observing quietly. Caroline spoke first. Miss Harper," she said, "we respect the significance of your business to this community. Our goal is to reach a mutually beneficial transition." Mutually beneficial. The phrase was carefully chosen because 2 weeks earlier, they hadn't offered anything close to that. I responded calmly. "Our goal is continuity," I said, "not compensation." She nodded. "That is reasonable." The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was structured, precise, because by this point, both sides understood the reality. They needed us to relocate voluntarily, and we needed stability to protect the business. After 90 minutes of negotiation, the final agreement took shape. Summit would purchase and renovate a new commercial space 2 blocks away. They would cover all moving costs. They would provide a 1-year revenue stabilization fund. And most importantly, they agreed to transfer the official historical preservation designation to the new location. That last condition mattered more than anything else, because it meant Harper Alterations wouldn't disappear. It would continue, recognized, protected, and supported. When Caroline slid the finalized agreement across the table, I read every line carefully before signing. Jessica did the same. No hesitation, no argument, because for the first time in 8 years, we weren't fighting each other. We were making a decision together. After the signatures were complete, Caroline stood and extended her hand. "Thank you for working with us," she said. Her tone was sincere, because she knew the truth. We hadn't just cooperated. We had negotiated from strength. Once they left, the shop felt unusually quiet. Jessica leaned against the cutting table, running her fingers lightly across its surface. "We're really moving," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. Her voice carried a note of something unexpected. Not sadness, not relief, something closer to acceptance. "For a long time," she said, "I thought protecting this place meant never letting it change." I looked at her, and now she met my gaze. "Now I understand. It means protecting what matters, not the building, but what we do inside it." Her words settled deeply, because that realization applied to more than just the shop. It applied to us, our relationship, our mother's legacy, all of it. 2 months later, Harper Alterations reopened in its new location. The new shop was brighter, larger, with wide windows that let in natural light all day. We placed the original cutting table in the center of the room, exactly where it belonged, not as a relic, but as a working part of the business. Because legacy isn't something you preserve by freezing it in place. You preserve it by allowing it to continue growing. The first day, we opened, a long-time client walked in carrying a wedding dress. She smiled when she saw us both standing behind the counter. "It's good to see you two together," she said. Jessica and I exchanged a brief glance. Not defensive, not cautious, just steady. "Some things are worth rebuilding," I replied. That night after closing, we sat in the quiet shop, surrounded by fabric bolts and soft light. Jessica spoke quietly. "Mom would have been proud of you." The words landed differently than they once would have. Not as validation, not as pressure, but as simple truth. "I think she would have been proud of us," I said. Jessica nodded, because this time she didn't argue. And for the first time since our mother died, I felt something settle fully inside me. Not victory, not revenge, something quieter. Peace. If there's one thing this entire journey taught me, it's this: you don't protect a legacy by holding on to control. You protect it by building something strong enough to survive without it. And sometimes the most powerful form of justice isn't watching someone lose. It's watching yourself continue forward, steady, calm, and unafraid. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to comment and subscribe, because there are many stories like this. Stories about family drama, betrayal, and the slow, steady power of karma. And if you've ever had to rebuild something you thought you lost forever, you already understand. The next story is waiting. And when you're ready, I'll tell it.